He's the author of Mobsters in Our Midst, The Kansas City Crime Family. Next, on American History TV, the former FBI agent sits down with Kansas City Public Broadcasting editor Jonathan Bender for an illustrated discussion of the city's gangland past and a look at a newly discovered archive of police reports, mugshots, and other records from the Kansas City Star newspaper. The Kansas City Public Library in Kansas City, Missouri hosted this 70-minute event.
Welcome. Welcome, everyone. My name is Jeremy Druin, and I manage the Missouri Valley Special Collections, the local and regional history department of the Kansas City Public Library. Our research room and archives are headquartered just across the hall from this auditorium. In the Missouri Valley Room, you will find books, articles, and newspaper clippings documenting the history of organized crime in Kansas City, from Black Hand era extortion and violence to syndicate bootlegging with ties to the Pendergast machine, through the 26-year reign of crime boss Nick Civella, a period associated with skimming casinos in Las Vegas and bombing businesses in the River Key. Whether we like it or not, organized crime is a part of our history. Moreover, it continues to capture our fascination as well as generate interest and new scholarship. Last year, the Special Collections Department acquired a piece of our Mafia past when the organized crime files of the Kansas City Star were donated by former Star reporter Mike McGraw. These files contained photos, notes, and reports on local Mafia members and provide a glimpse of how reporters investigated the mob during its heyday. A story about the collection by Jonathan Bender, Jesse Howe, and Mike McGraw was featured in KCPT's digital magazine, Flatland, which included a short interview with retired FBI agent William Owsley. Today, Mr. Owsley and Mr. Bender are here to dig deeper into the Star's files and take a closer look at Kansas City's gangland past. William Owsley is an authority on the Kansas City mob. In his 25 years with the FBI, he spent 2 decades investigating and prosecuting organized crime figures. As an expert witness on mob activities, he testified in federal courts and before a U.S. Senate investigations panel. He retired in 1985 as the supervisor of the organized crime squad of the Kansas City FBI Field Division. He is also the author of 2 books, Open City, True Story of the KC Crime Family, and Mobsters in Our Midst. These titles are available for purchase in bookstores and through Amazon.com. Jonathan Bender has a job that many of us envy. As food editor for Kansas City Public Television, he reports on the best drinking and dining establishments in the metro area. In addition to writing about what Kansas Cityans eat and drink, he has produced some stories on local history, including Call of the Sandlot, which looked back at Sandlot baseball in Kansas City and its revival. You'll find his work at kcpt.org and flatlandkc.org. He is also the author of 3 books, Stock, Broth, and Bowl, Cookies and Beer, 2 of my favorites, and Lego, A Love Story. Please join me in welcoming to the Kansas City Public Library, Jonathan Bender and William Owsley.
So I just want to thank everyone for joining us here. I'm delighted that you're going to have the opportunity to hear this story today. I wanted to tell you a bit about how this collection actually arrived at the Kansas City Library. So I work across the desk from Mike McGraw, who's a longtime Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter for the Kansas City Star, who's now a special projects reporter with Kansas City Public Television and Flatland, KC.org, KCPT's digital magazine. And getting to sit across from Mike, you get to hear some great stories, one of which was the provenance of this collection here in the Special Collections room. And these collection files actually had their first home on the 3rd floor of the Kansas City Star building in what's known as the library, although they have a more affectionate term for it. They often call it the morgue, because that's where stories go to their final rest. And so Mike had walked up, he was working on a different story, this is some years back, And you have to imagine there's rows of file cabinets. They are green and tan and white, and they stretch the entire length of the 3rd floor. Now, at one time, the morgue or the library was a bustling room. There were 6 librarians who worked for the Star, whose sole job it was to cut out clippings. They would take different parts of the paper that they wanted to keep for history's sake, or photos, or reporters' notes. They all ended up in this room as this collection of both Kansas City's history and the paper's history as well. Now, over the years, unfortunately, the library staff winnowed, and it was down to 1. And when Mike got up there researching this story, he found a librarian throwing out files into a 50-gallon drum. And Mike asked what the librarian was doing, and she said, "I'm making more room." And Mike was horrified, and he said, "Can I have those files?" She said, "Sure." So he brought them down into the newsroom. He put them away in his own file cabinet, because that's what you do with newly acquired files. You refile them. And then after that, they went home to his house when an editor chased those files out of the newsroom because, again, they wanted to make room. And they sat at Mike's house for several years before he came here, and he thought they might have a home at the library. The library agreed, and through the work of Jeremy Druin, as well as Joanna Marsh, the archivist on this project, they created this organized crime files collection. Now, the lovely part is we're going to be able to spend some time here giving you a peek inside, but it's also just right down the hall. So I really encourage you to take some time and delve further in if you have an interest. But again, while it's really interesting to get into paper files or photos or hear about history, it's a lot better to hear it from somebody who was actually there. And so I'm joined by retired FBI agent William Owsley, and I would love to hear, if you could, kind of take me back to the beginnings of organized crime and how organized crime came to Kansas City.
Well, the roots of this evil go back to the last part of the 20th century and into the 1900s with the beginnings. What we had happening here was a change of immigrant flow. The Irish before, the Southern Italians and Sicilians had dominated Kansas City, and now there was a new group, and they settled in the north side, in the north end, and they created a little Italy, a piece of the old country. These were good people. They were God-fearing, industrious, and most of all, law-abiding. But a small fraction of these people, that came here, unfortunately, were the ne'er-do-wells, the criminally bent. And those people that had one way or the other a connection with the secret societies in the old country. There was the Sicilian Mafia, best known. There was the Camorra of Naples, and the 'Ndrangheta of southern Italy, the Calabria region. These people brought with them a mindset from the old country. It wasn't the Mafia transported here. It was their protocols, their way of doing business. And it would be a form of crime as it developed unknown on these shores. And I think for many years, unrecognized for its sophistication. So they were factionalized. There wasn't one mafia group. They fought amongst each other for territory, but they were basically thugs. And their main criminal activity was to extort their fellow countrymen. And there were bombings, there were murders if you didn't pay. Now, this was called the Black Hand era. The letters had a black hand demanding money. Now, they had no great power at this time. They had no influence outside the boundaries of Little Italy. But then 1920 came. 1920 was the beginning of Prohibition. And the unintended consequence of Prohibition was it created organized crime. Not only here, but around the country. It was a product demanded by the masses. And organized crime people supplied, gave those people what they wanted. The North Enders, who one of the old country things is to make wine and beer, the bathtub gin, they used to call it, they jumped in with both feet And soon, because of who they were, they dominated the field. But they were fighting each other. That wasn't good for business. So in 1928, the leaders of the most important factions, they got together, and in order for better business, they unified. They consolidated. And we could say that that is the beginning of what we call today the Kansas City crime family. Now, with that power, the first thing they did, because the Mafia is politically astute, and that sets them aside from most organized crime groups. They are heavy into politics, because in Sicily, they are the government. So they went down, they took over by force the Tom Pendergast political apparatus of the North Side. Now, you all probably heard of Tom Pendergast. They had a corrupt political machine, and he controlled most of the city by this time. Now, with those votes in hand, Johnny Lazia, who this consolidated group put out front as the boss, in the back are the old-timers who really ran things. But they needed an out-front boss, a guy that could speak good English, and he looked good. And John Lazia was a handsome man, and he could interface with people. So he, with those votes in hand, heads up to see Tom Pendergast and forces an alliance. So now we have an unholy alliance of a powerful political machine that's controlling most of the politics of the city, all the city offices, all of those came through the machine, and you team that up with a powerful, vicious criminal group, and that did not bode well for the city. Now, the next thing that came the way of organized crime was in 1929, we had the stock market crash and the Depression. Well, who had all the money? Who had all the money at this time? The banks weren't lending. Nobody was helping anybody. But I'll tell you who had all the money, and I guess you can figure it out. The mob had all the money. And so they used that money to infiltrate the political, the social, the economic fabric of our city. We're famous for Kansas City jazz. That whole era, when that was built, the clubs and the big guys coming in, Duke Ellington, the mob financed all that. They owned all of that, along with Tom Pendergast. Well, the next step in this story is in 1931, as a result of a conflict in New York, all of these particular families, they were families like this Kansas City group in Cleveland, in Detroit, in New York, in Boston, in Providence. They all grew up pretty much the same way. And they knew each other from the old country. There were ties, but there wasn't a national syndicate of these crime families. Now there was. They put this together on a national basis. They formulated a commission of so many bosses who would rule on certain interfamily problems. So this had the semblance of a corporate entity. So that was more power for the Kansas City crime family. Then in 1932 was the pièce de résistance for this group. The Supreme Court of Missouri ruled that the Board of Police Commissioners had to be elected locally. Well, who was there locally? There was John Lazia and there was Tom Pendergast. So they elected the Board of Police Commissioners. And that was when they took over the city lock, stock, and barrel. They opened it up for every kind of vice and evil doings that you can imagine. It was truly an open city.
So with the open city,
yeah.
you have that.
How did that book title come?
That's the title of Bill's first book.
But anyway, gangsters, the roaring 30s gangsters, the Dillingers, they would come to Kansas City for rest and relaxation. They wouldn't be arrested. Check in with John Lazia and you play golf and whatever. This was a notorious city. And the money flowed in. Every racket had to kick in a tribute to the Lazia Pendergast combine. They called it the lug. And this money flowed in, you can imagine, by the millions. Now, 1933, Prohibition is over. The mob is now looking for new vistas. Gambling is one that they got into. But during the 30s, they continue to grow. They continue to prosper. They don't go away because there's no more bootlegging. And gradually, as these other criminal groups that were in bootlegging do fade away, it's the national crime syndicate that we called Cosa Nostra that gradually takes over. And in Kansas City, the group didn't have any resistance or competition. So they were the big dog. And they got fatter, wealthier, stronger, politically stronger, and what have you. So these were the heydays. Then the wheels came off in 1939. Pendergast and the new mob boss, Charlie Corolla, were indicted, went to jail. The reformers took over finally. They had been fighting for years unsuccessfully against the machine. They cleared out City Hall. They cleared out everybody. The mob had to surface or go underground, so to speak. They didn't have the protection of the police department, but they weren't going away. They weren't going away. They just didn't have a high profile. And at this time, we would call it the Binaggio era. The guy who became the mob leader was more well known for having taken over the Pendergast machine. He was now the top Democrat political functionary in Kansas City. And it's interesting to me that they referred to him in the papers more as a politic guy than a mob leader. But anyway, his time was coming soon because in the late 1940s, there was a groundswell against this open gambling. The gambling syndicates that were here, not only Cosa Nostra people, but other gambling entities. There were federal grand juries, local grand juries. The heat was on. There was pressure. And Charlie Binaggio had to go. He and his chief lieutenant, Charlie Gargotto, were murdered up on 15th Street in the Democratic political headquarters. And that led into the Kefauver Committee. They came here in 1950, holding organized crime, or their national view of organized crime was their mandate. Kansas City, because of its reputation, was the second stop. So that takes us to 1950, Jonathan.
That's right. And so that's the chart that's right behind us.
Right.
That would have been one of the things that when the investigators came to town, they looked at based on files prepared from star reporters or the investigators that they had sent ahead from San Francisco. You mentioned Binaggio. I wanted to ask you about one of his lieutenants. So featured in this collection fairly extensively, there are both profile notes as well as a series of delightful mugshots, if you can call a mugshot delightful, of Tony Gizzo, who's on the left-hand side for you folks in the audience. So can you talk a bit about Binaggio's relationship to Gizzo and that succession?
Yeah. By the way, I have a suit like that. When John Lazia became the boss, it was sort of an Americanization process. He wasn't from Sicily. They called those guys the Mustache Petes. They didn't speak good English, low profile, didn't want anybody to know who they were, dressed down, not like these guys, the American guys. So Lazia brought up around him some of the younger thugs that were his cadre. Tony Gizzo was one of those. Charlie Binaggio, who I mentioned, was one of those. Charlie Gargata, who was killed with Charlie Binaggio.
Charlie Gargata's in the top right there if you're looking.
Right, he was one of those. And the last, there was 5 of them, was Tana Lococo. An interesting point, Tana Lococo lived to be 100 years. So I think he spent more time as a gangster than anybody in the United States, because he started young. But those 5 made up the Iron Horses, and as leadership changed, John Lazio was murdered in '34, these were the stable, this was the continuity. These guys continued to grow in power, and they did the work of the crime family.
So there you talked about this concept earlier of organized crime and machine politics working together. As part of this collection, there's a letter behind me, and it talks about Tom Pendergast, who is actually the nephew of Tom Pendergast,
Jim.
young Jim.
Yeah.
And so apparently Tony Gizzo had gone to visit him, and it says, just in case you can't read it, that Pendergast at the time had gotten more than 100 phone calls threatening him and his family. And he was very irritated by this. And Gizzo came to see him. Gizzo said, "Who's been threatening you?" Pendergast tells him of all the threats, and Gizzo says, "Well, I'm the top man here. What I say goes. I give the orders. I didn't tell anyone to threaten you, and it will stop right now." And it did.
Yeah, well, probably when this letter was written, the Binaggio people had taken over. Jim Pendergast was now a minor figure, and Gizzo was now even a bigger figure than he was, and of course, in the earlier days. Now, whether, it's an old mafia tactic to create a problem and then solve it. That's how it works. That's how you may, I don't know if you've heard of them, but they used to be labor consultants. And what would happen is trouble was created. You went to the labor consultant, who was the mob, and they fixed it for you. So whether Gizzo was playing this game with Jim Pendergast, that he'd fix it, and had set up all these phone calls, or whether it was actually he was being harassed, but Tony Gizzo was the guy that could fix it. He had that stature at that time, and he very well could have taken care of it.
Yeah, later on, there's another set here. So this is a note that came to Ira McCarty, who's a longtime political and legislative reporter at the Kansas City Star. It mentions a meeting between Gizzo, and it also talks about 2 gentlemen who were coming in from Chicago who are the cousins of Al Capone. Earlier you mentioned this idea of Kansas City being part of the national landscape.
Right. But
at that time, was Kansas City a place that would have had ties to Chicago or organized crime nationally?
Yeah, Chicago and Kansas City have always had a very close relationship. And it goes back into this era. Gizzo and the then boss, Tony Accardo, were on first-name basis. They traveled around Gizzo traveled around the country. He was well known. He showed up in other mobsters' phone books that were seized over the time. And there was a very important relationship. Part of it was in the bootlegging era. Part of it was when they created what was called the National Wire Service. This was telegraph lines that brought in race results for the local bookie. It was controlled by the Capone mob, and they gave a franchise to Kansas City. So there were very tight ties, and Civella continued that in his reign of power.
And so to get us up to speed, to 1950 takes us to the Kefauver hearings. There's been the murder of the 2 Charlies, Gargata and Binaggio, and as a result, there's some intense scrutiny on Kansas City, but there is also perhaps the first look into actual organized crime in Kansas City. I mean, can you talk about what the Kefauver hearings did in 1950 and the path that set us on?
Yeah, well, and that's where the files that you may look at played a big part. I believe that much of that documentation, the profiles of all these people. You have to remember, there was nobody looking at these people as a criminal entity. If they robbed a bank, they go after them. But it wasn't looking at them as a crime family. So there wasn't a great deal of intelligence. As we have today, organized crime squads, intelligence units, in the police departments, there wasn't a lot of profiling. And so the files, when Kefauver came here and needed some background, these files gave him the profiles of these people. Some of the stories I told you about, Gizzo and Lococo, they put it together, and that's what Kefauver used, and he called in all of these people, all the gamblers, all the mafioso, all the politicians, and it was quite a show. And his findings were devastating. Unfortunately, when he left town, nothing much happened.
So it was a big year in 1950. I mean, the next year of historical significance is probably 1957 in terms of our discussion.
Right.
Can you talk a bit about the Appalachin Gangbang Convention?
As I say, unfortunately, the Kefauver Committee went all over the country, and they really did a wonderful job exposing these people. Nobody followed up. No real laws came out of it. But so we were, the situation was status quo. They were doing big money, making money, and nobody was doing much about them. For the most part, there wasn't a recognition of La Cosa Nostra, a national syndicate. The only law enforcement agency that recognized what they were was the Bureau of Narcotics, because they were working abroad and saw the chain of distribution of narcotics. They were getting information about the Sicilian Mafia and how they tied to the United States. So anyway, it would have been status quo, but in November of 1957, the board of directors of La Cosa Nostra had to have a meeting, just like Apple has a meeting. And they're similar to Apple in a way. I mean, they're making maybe more money than Apple was. So the board of directors slip up to a little sleepy town of Appalachin, New York, and think they're going to be safe. An alert state policeman who had been looking into the background of these people didn't like what he saw up at this estate of the Joe Barbera. All these out-of-town cars, set up a roadblock, broke up this enormous meeting. Guys were running into the woods. People were jumping in taxi cabs. And two of our people, Nick Civella and Joe Filardo, two representatives from here, attended that meeting, letting you know the stature of our family. Well, with the uncovering of Appalachin, or Appalachin, either way, it was a groundswell against organized crime. Legislative bodies, the newspapers, law enforcement, investigating reporters, the whole thing became quite the story. And FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, who maybe didn't recognize organized crime, but nobody else did at that time. He's taken a lot of heat for that, maybe rightly. But the day after the meeting, he formed what he called then the top hoodlum squads. And that's what I worked for 20 years after I got to Kansas City, was organized crime. And gradually the laws started to catch up.
And at the time, so we had a series of successions back in Kansas City. You went from Binaggio, then on to Tony Gizzo. Tony Gizzo passed away in 1953. Next in line was potentially Nick Civella. So you had Nick Civella and Joe Filardo was with him. Nick represents the new line. Joe Filardo is the old guard.
Right.
Can you talk a bit about that transition and how Civella came up?
Yeah. First of all, Nick Civella was the most unlikely person you'd ever imagine to become the boss. In fact, he had defied the mob. And twice they tried to kill him. Twice he fled to Chicago. Now, how he rehabilitated himself, I don't know, but he did. In fact, Tony Gizzo was responsible with working with the Chicago people to give Nick a free pass back. Gizzo had made him his driver, which is the career development path in organized crime. So, because Tony Accardo had been Capone's driver. So, but anyway, so he spoke for the boss. He gained power, and he was appointed as the new chief when Gizzo died of natural causes. And then he had to be introduced. So the meeting was coming about. It was a good opportunity. Joe Filardo, being the old mustache Pete, who knew everybody in New York and the East Coast. He came from there, he lived there a while, brought Nick to the meeting to introduce him. And Nick was now the anointed boss. But as it was in the old days, there was always somebody behind him. In fact, they called Joe Filardo the bakery because they were up at the Roma Bakery. That's what he ran. And they were the silent, hidden power brokers. But eventually Nick broke away from them and became the independent, on his own boss, and he was held that position for 25, 26 years.
And in the early days of did you call them the hoodlum squads?
The top hoodlum squad.
Top hoodlum squad. What was it like for you if you were trying to track somebody? What laws did you have at your disposal? Did you have any tools that you could use initially?
Well, very briefly, when I first came to the squad here, we had one statute that came out of the Kefauver hearings, and it involved interstate transportation in gambling, arson, extortion, several crimes linked to interstate travel. So if you traveled interstate to conduct your gambling business, it was a law. If we didn't have the interstate, we had no jurisdiction. And of course, these people are astute. They have lawyers. They know what's going on. So they stayed, or they were very circumspect in traveling or violating the state line. We couldn't wiretap at this time, so that was out. So basically, our first years was gathering intelligence, developing informants, learning who our opponents were. There was a lot to learn about these people. Like I say, there wasn't any previous intelligence base. And so we were in that mode.
And so it sounds to me like once electronic surveillance came into the picture, that really changed your methods for how you could track somebody or potentially bring them to justice.
Yeah, well, it did. But prior to that, as I say, as we developed more information as to what made the mob tick, the Department of Justice would then promote legislation in that area. For example, we didn't need interstate gambling when they passed the IGB, which was illegal gambling business. Now we only needed 5 people who made $2,000. Well, they made that in 5 minutes. So that's all we needed. Now we could make bookmaking cases. Then the loan sharking law came in, and that helped, gave us the ability to go after the loan sharks. So gradually, laws were catching up, but it was still a tough battle. People didn't want to talk to us. People were afraid of the mob. I don't blame them. And it was a struggle until 1969. Well, about 1969, finally, the Congress passed what's called a Title III, which made legal electronic eavesdropping. And that turned the whole picture around. Because now this was evidence from the mobster's mouth, could not be intimidated, could not be parsed, and it was the beginning of the end for La Cosa Nostra, really.
And so there's a moment in your own personal history where I feel like a wild chain of events begins outside of a dress shop.
Well, this was the... now, first of all, you need to remember, many people think law enforcement willy-nilly is using electronic surveillance, checking on everybody, every neighbor. It is a monstrous procedure to get authority. So we have to build probable cause. So we had a tip on a bookmaker who was operating a dress shop across from City Hall. I guess they didn't see him. I don't know. Well, City Hall, it's a very difficult street there. I think, what was that, 11th Street? You can't park. I couldn't sit in the car because they move you on and what have you. So what I did, trying to find out who was coming to the shop, what were his hours, could I see him on the phone, I just pranced around 11th Street, up and down, in and out, in the building, out the building, sitting on. And what's amazing, ladies and gentlemen, is you would think somebody eventually said, what the hell are you doing here? But it's busy enough. And to make this long story short, I was gaining intelligence. And one day, it was a lull. The guy was away from the shop. And I was tired. Went across to this little bitty cafe to get a cup of coffee. And who struts in but one of the managers of the main crime family bookmaking operation. And he sits down at the stool and he asks the counterman, where is Louis next door? So now I have a connection with the downtown bookmaking central headquarters, and I understand who Louis is connected with. This was the kind of probable cause we had to build. And from there, we built a wiretap case against a satellite bookmaking operation, and that took us down to the North End Social Club that was the headquarters for the book.
Right, but even then, your job isn't done. So it sounds like you've done a lot of work, but there's a payphone in the social club that you want to get a tap on. It's not an easy task in those days.
I told you this was a difficult process, getting this. Well, here's a good example. When we finally got all the probable cause for the Northview Social Club called the Trap, which is typical of almost everywhere, they have a social club that's their headquarters. That's where they play illegal. They have their illegal dice games, card games. They hang out. They talk business. This is the mob office. Well, the phone that they were using, interestingly enough, now this is back in 1960s, was a payphone. So we put together our affidavit, sent it back to the Department of Justice, and the legal back there comes back and he says, this is a payphone. You're not going to infringe on the public by listening in to every call. It can only be, you can only listen in when the bookmaking manager is on the phone. Nobody else. Nobody else. So I told the guy, because I was doing the affidavit, I told the guy, do you understand that this is the mob headquarters? Do you think John Doe off the street can walk in there and use that payphone? I said, you're nuts. It's impossible. And then I said, I'll tell you what, you come out. Well, he said, hey, it's a payphone. That was his answer. I said, but you can't use it. So I said, I'll tell you what, you come out here, I will give you a dime. And if you can go in there and make a phone call. I'll kiss your rear end on the federal building steps. So these were the trials and tribulations of organized crime investigation. And to finish the story, this was the Super Bowl week when the Chiefs were playing the Vikings. So all of the money coming into the book was on the Chiefs. Now, a bookmaking operation can't stand that. You can't have all the money on one side. You got nobody to pay them. So they need to balance their books. They need to get some of this money bet somewhere else. Well, they had not been in the habit of doing that because it was never a big problem. So because of this, every guy every guy in the trap, and they were bringing in other guys who maybe had a connection, got on the phone, and we had to turn it off. That one wiretap may have cleaned out the whole crime family.
One of the voices of who you heard there was Nick Civella.
That's right, but amazingly enough, it was so bad, Nick the boss called in himself. Now, this would have never happened on an ordinary betting weekend. And he wanted to know, what's going on. That conversation, there were several of them, gave us the impetus to indict and prosecute the boss, which we never expected from a bookmaking case.
So just because you went for a cup of coffee outside of a dress shop.
That's how it works.
And so over time, Nick Civella was, for over 20 years, part of the fabric of the outfit here in Kansas City. And at that same time, there was a lot of development going on in Las Vegas. And so as Nick Civella rose in power and Las Vegas became developed, it also put a career, your arc of your career was part of that investigation.
Yeah, Nick was a very astute guy, underrated nationally. He really had great power, mainly because he had compromised Roy Williams, the top Teamster official in Kansas City. He was the director of the Central Conference of the Teamsters Union. He was a vice president, and he was Nick's man. Well, you can imagine having somebody like that, and the mob was involved heavily in labor racketeering, that Nick was a very important guy around the country. They had to come to him to get things done with the Teamsters. This played perfectly into his hands because starting in 1947, the mob had started to infiltrate Las Vegas, and really not infiltrate because it was legal to open casinos. And the first guy to open a casino was a guy named Bugsy Siegel, who was Meyer Lansky's guy, and Lansky was a big shot in the national syndicate. Not Cosa Nostra, but there was a national syndicate at that time. Other racketeers sat with the Italian racketeers until they finally was no one else left but the Italian racketeers. But so gradually the mob got into Vegas heavily. Well, Nick wanted a piece of that. His first effort was the strong arm effort. He went out and tried to strong arm one of the owners. He ended up on the Vegas Black Book. They put together a black book of people who are not accepted in the casinos. He was one of the founders of the Black Book. There were 10 guys, and he and his brother and another Kansas City racketeer. We had 3 people on the list.
So well, we had 3 of the 11.
Three of the 11, whatever they were, yeah. A notable achievement.
But over time, he did find his way in. So 5 years after the trap in 1974, you've got a great story about Valentine's Day.
Well, to lead up to this, in the 70s, there was upheaval in the mob here, unusual. A faction started to rival Civella. There was a lot of violence, people stalking each other, trying to kill each other. We were involved, the police department. And it led us to putting a microphone in a restaurant up on Independence Avenue. We were looking for murder, and we came up with a conversation that involved their involvement in Las Vegas. We followed that thread, got the probable cause, got the wiretap authority, and we opened a massive investigation indicating Nick Civella's involvement in several hotels, along with other racketeers, the cities of Chicago, Cleveland, Milwaukee. The Midwest families had conspired to own secretly these hotels and to skim money out of the casino count rooms. It's what they call skim, just money off the top, stolen money. And then they would curry the money back and split it up. So Nick was heavily involved in Vegas affairs. And a lot of it had to do because he had that Teamster control, and many of the casinos, the front men for the casinos, were financed by Teamster pension fund loans. Nick Civella and his buddies were the ones who said, you get the loan. You didn't make an application. You didn't go through that process. You had to be sponsored. So when the person seeking money to buy the Tropicana or whatever, he had to be sponsored, then he had to kick back money, and he had to give up control of the casino so they could skim that money. We called it the straw man case. It was about 14 months, and we had wiretaps all over the place. Chicago did, Milwaukee did, Vegas did, following our lead. And that case not only broke the back of the local mob here, but it was the end of the line for Las Vegas.
So you talked about skimming. It's such an interesting concept of how money came from Las Vegas to Kansas City. Can you talk about how
the
people
Valentine,
actually
sorry. The case was brought down, interestingly enough, 50 years after the massacre, or the St. Valentine's Day massacre in Chicago. 50 years later, we went out on the streets with 50 or 60 search warrants. All of the main guys here, and I was scheduled to go to the airport because our searches were keyed on $80,000 in skim money coming to Kansas City via a courier. So we waited for him up at the airport. He got off the plane. We're waiting there by the carousel. He picks up his bag, so we grab him, put him in a security office, and we begin the search. Now, there had been a lot of thinking about how did this skim money come? Was it hidden in secret compartments in a suitcase, or maybe like in somebody's shoe, or what have you? Well, we were surprised because I said to this courier, I said, empty your pockets. And the first thing he did, pulled $40,000 out of this big pocket and $40,000 out of this pocket and put it on the table. And that was the skim money. So I said, where's the secret suitcase? Come on. So, and then when I said to him, whose money is that? He said, that's casino money. I said, it sure is. So he didn't put the stolen on it, but.
So this was only going to end one way. The dapper gentleman in sunglasses is you on the right.
Yeah, that's a long time ago.
The gentleman in the middle is Nick Civella. Can you talk about the end of that era and about what happened?
Well, by the way, this was when we arrested Nick as a result of that gambling case. Just a quick story.
Yeah.
When we went up to get him, he was on a golf course at Mirror Lake. And there were three of us, and we were waiting around the 18th hole in our suits and all that. and this ball comes up. We couldn't see over. This ball comes over, and a second ball. He was with his wife, and he had to chip to the green. And he looked up and he saw us, and his chip went way over. And he dropped the club and walked over, and we arrested him. But Nick went to jail on this case. Then when he came out, we had developed another case, so he went back to jail.
How long was he in jail in this case?
In the gambling case, he got a 3-year sentence, and he did two and change. Then he went back to jail. Meanwhile, of course, his organization is operating. They're under stress because of the conflict, and he's running Vegas from the jail, his interests there, and the straw man case develops, but Nick is in jail at this time, and he is not around, unfortunately, when we indicted the Vegas straw man case. But he was so sick that he was released on health issues, and he died in 1983. So that was the finality of this strong boss. And the straw man prosecutions took out the rest of the hierarchy of the Kansas City family. And from there, it was downhill. It was sort of the end of my career. I retired about that time, testified for another year as these cases went on. The mob continued on for a while, but they were no more. They were no more.
So it's, I mean, if you take a man out in the middle of his golf game, he thought he was going to the clubhouse. You took him to the big house.
Yeah.
And with us, that takes us to the end of our portion of the presentation. We wanted to make sure we could open this up for questions. There's aisles on both sides with microphones. If you have a question, please come forward and feel free to ask it. We ask you just to ask one question because there are a lot of you here, and we'd like to get through as many as possible.
Yeah, can you tell me, and this is in relationship to a follow-up on the Kefauver committee, which was what, 1950?
Right.
Did Hoover oppose that, J. Edgar?
Did what?
Did he oppose the results of that? Or I'm wondering, I've always wondered why nothing ever happened from that one.
Well, interestingly enough, the person who opposed the Kefauver committee hearings was Harry Truman as president. He felt it was going to embarrass the Democrats in the city, and it did. No, I thought Hoover.
He was still president then.
Yeah. When the Kefauver committee was proposed, he opposed it. But anyway, no, Hoover. It wasn't the fact that anybody individually opposed the Kefauver committee. It was just the general inertia of the time. Yeah. People were not ready to take up the reins, as they did after Appalachin. After Appalachin, you had legislators, press, you had everybody wanting to get in the act. Nothing happened like that after Kefauver.
One other thing was the follow-up when they had their great meeting in 1932, 33. This is the one when Lucky Luciano had pulled together and brought in Capone and the rest of them. Didn't the government have any knowledge of that, or?
No. There was nobody following these people, as I said.
Okay.
You have to understand, this is an era of a criminal organization that was unrecognized for what they were. So. Okay. There wasn't any. Now, there were police officers probably who were on the know. There were a lot of bent police officers around the country because of the times. There were bent politicians. But generally speaking, the powers to be that we needed didn't exist.
All right, so we broke our social contract on the first question. Let's limit it to one question going forward. Sir.
My compliments, Jonathan and Agent. I'll say I've been coming a lot of years, and this is the biggest crowd I've ever seen in this auditorium. So, but we know that the executions of the two Charlies, Bonaggio and Gargata, were never solved. Well, do you tell us this very day, Agent Owsley, who executed the two Charlies?
Gee.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
The same guy who buried Hoffa.
Yes, sir. I would change the topic slightly from crime to perhaps philosophy. With the idea, it's what respectable society does is brings down a country or brings it up. The question is, nowadays you have gambling boats, as you know. If you want to play the numbers, the state of Missouri is more than happy to accommodate you, take your money, and help you out. Now, there's no violence to speak. Everything's peaceful. Everything's, everybody's getting along. Everybody's civilized. There's nobody getting killed in the streets. And so my philosophical question is, do you think society is better off today where things are legal, gambling, especially gambling, which is a big chunk of organized crime's money, obviously? Are we better off with our present situation where if you want to gamble, all you got to do is go to the boat and have at it? If you want to buy a numbers ticket, you just go down and get a lottery ticket. Is that a better scenario?
Well, I'm very deep philosophically, by the way. But if you want to look at it, the first thing is gambling is no good. If you accept that premise, then no gambling is any good. That's my nothing good comes of gambling. Nothing. Okay. Now, if we want to take the next step, that, well, hey, we're going to have gambling. You're never going to stop the people. Well, then this is a better system than the mob running it.
Right.
Okay? Because as a result of the work we did and the police department and the prosecutors, gambling today is made very clean because they know how it's infiltrated. They make laws when they pass them that are accurate and keep the mob out. So, yes, it's better right now.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for coming. Did the mob have anything to do with the technical difficulties at the opening of this presentation?
Of the what?
Of the technical difficulties at the opening.
I didn't.
The technical difficulties at the opening. We'll give a no comment.
Okay. The other question is...
Again with the second question.
well, just one comment then.
Yeah. The first was a joke.
All right.
The comment is that there's been talk in commentary that J. Edgar Hoover was afraid of the Mafia, and he did not want to go after them because he thought that would put his agents at risk, and he just didn't want to challenge them.
Well, first of all, back in that time period, I had nothing to do with law enforcement. I mean, we're talking about the 50s, leading up to Appalachin. So, I wasn't in the bureau at that time where you might hear rumor. But my feeling is that prior to Appalachin, Hoover was in a group of everybody else who really did not accept fully there could be such an entity as Cosa Nostra. This society, this brotherhood with blood initiation and codes of conduct and infiltrating everything. It wasn't accepted. It wasn't accepted.
But what about Malachi? I mean, didn't he?
That was 1964.
Oh, okay.
We were already Valachi was the result of our organized crime program. Hoover's organized crime program. They developed Valachi. So anyway, no, I don't, he, as I said, all I can tell you is when I came into the FBI, I wanted to get into the organized crime program that he established the day after Appalachin. I don't know. So you draw the conclusions. That's all I can say.
Yeah, I was just curious as to what kind of personal fortune that Nick Civella had by the end of his life.
That's a good question because I'd like to know that myself. They're very secretive about their money, and they don't buy CDs. They don't have AT&T stock. No paper trail. No paper trail. They do things like collect diamonds. We took a bunch of diamonds from Nick Civella's home, and I think that's where some of the money was going. But how and where and what they did to put that money aside was something we didn't solve it.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for coming and giving us your presentation.
Well, thank you for coming yourself.
You're welcome. My question is, would you please comment on the bombing in the River Key area and what happened there and how it was resolved?
All right. Do we have 2 hours?
Short version.
Yeah. Very briefly, the River Key developed because the West 12th Street prostitute bars with prostitutes and go-go dancers, which was an organized crime thing, that was closed down because of the Marriott. They looked for a place to go. The River Key was supposed to be very family-oriented, clean, and what have you. And a guy by the name Freddie Bonadonna became the mayor, unofficial mayor. Well, the mob needed to move these joints somewhere. The Key was right over the thruway. So they came, now they want to develop and dominate the River Key. Thereby a struggle, violence, murder, and what it boiled down to is the mob trying to take over the River Key.
Take over from whom?
Well, so we're going to leave it to microphone questions, but we'll put this in the sequel of this.
Yeah. Well, let me tell you, take over from who? From the legitimate businessmen. They wanted to put all this dirty X-rated movie houses, all that. So Freddie Bonadonna and the artisan down the street with his glass shop and this, who's going to go down there? That would have been the end of the Key.
Go ahead, ma'am. Thank you.
Yes. I grew up during this time. My dad was U.S. attorney, so he was dealing with a lot of this too.
U.S. attorney?
Yes. Russell Millen.
Oh, Russell Millen, yes.
And so our family got a lot of threats. I know, and I was wondering if you got any threats on your family and your life as you were investigating what was going on.
No, not really. That was, I don't know who's threatening Millen, but this organization didn't use those tactics. They understood. Now, in Sicily, they killed policemen, but they didn't do that in this country because this is an Americanized mafia. They understood that whereas over there it wouldn't make a big splash, you kill an FBI agent, a Russell Millen, or even a reporter who was doing there's going to be a backlash. And they also know there's someone to take their place. So now, sometimes on the street, one of these guys might say, "I'm going to get you, Owsley." Well, you know But the idea that they were going to threaten us to put us off with calls to my home, no. I'm surprised to hear he had all those.
I shouldn't say a lot, but a few.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Getting back to this great collection that's here in the library, has this inspired you to write a third book?
Well, unfortunately, that collection really is a profile. I mean, a lot of that is in my book. The first book covers that whole period. All these characters, the Kefauver committee, all that I had profiled for you in the beginning, the development of the mob. So it's going to take something else to get me to write a book.
I understand that Civella and them, they were against the drugs and the prostitution, and that was part of their...
Yeah, they were. There's two stories there. One, Tony Gizzo's son was an addict, and he ended up killing himself. And there was always that aura of what drugs do. So the one bright part of that theme that they didn't do it because look what they did. But Nick didn't do it because narcotics was dangerous. And it led to long prison terms. It led to his own people using drugs. Then they become informants, and it was just not a good thing. And thirdly, Kansas City is a very small community compared to Chicago. Nick knew that if his people were doing drugs, he would no longer have any community support.
We'll go here first and then there. Go ahead.
Was there any tie-in to Pittsburgh, Kansas?
Yeah, in a way. Some of the people from Pittsburgh came up here and were involved in some of the activities. The biggest connection was the Chicago boss, Joey Ayupa, would go down there to hunt doves. That was his favorite place to go. Now, when Ayupa hunts doves, it was probably with a machine gun. Because he was stopped by law enforcement, and his trunk, he had so many doves they didn't know, they lost count, and he was charged and got the nickname Joey Doves Ayupa.
Are any of the big palatial homes around Kansas City that still exist belong to any of these guys?
Well, yeah. The Pendergast mansion is still there. The house that Charlie Bonaggio lived in is still there. It's off of Ward Parkway. They lived in those neighborhoods. Yeah, there's a lot of and all of the North End, when they moved up to the north side to Philomena Acres, those homes are still there. Yeah.
Well, the place in Ward Parkway, the address.
Do I have the address? I'm lucky to remember my home address.
And I'm not going to end with a question, but a thank you. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for our speakers today, William Owsley and Jonathan Bender.